The JCPOA spells out sanctions lifting in stages. The 18th of October will see the arms embargo on Iran terminated. But that is not the US's intention. It started rallying in August to extend that embargo. But this time, its allies said enough is enough. And now the US wants to trigger the snapback mechanism to reimpose all sanctions on Iran. All sanctions, meaning the arms embargo will stay in place, and Iran will have to suspend all nuclear enrichment-related and reprocessing activities. Because imports to Iran will be banned. Imports of anything that can contribute to those activities. But not to worry. In trying to incarcerate Iran further, the US is finding itself on the outside. I'm Leila Faramarzi, and you're watching Iran Today. Friends and foes alike can see the US folly and have turned their backs on the US. Experts and authorities are mostly vindicated in seeing the US isolated on the world political stage. Not accustomed to taking no for an answer, the US is battering on at closed doors to get the snapback mechanism triggered against Iran. Now, how would such action look from a legal standpoint, from the standpoint of international law? And should the US succeed, what will it mean for UN Security Council resolutions in future? I'm here in Parliament to ask some MPs. They are quite vocal today.
When you sit at a negotiating table and accept all terms and then fail on all promises, naturally the world will lose confidence in you. Having done so, withdrawing from Iran's nuclear deal, the US has even caused skepticism among its own allies about future cooperation. From the very beginning, we did not trust the Americans. That was the case even during the talks. It provides solid proof that the US and its likes would not remain committed to their own promises.
The Americans have adopted diverse sanctions against us, ranging from sanctions adopted at the United Security Council to the sanctions slapped by the US Congress, US administration, and finally the European Union. No evidence has so far emerged of Iran's violation of NPT terms.
The 2015 JCPOA Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Iran nuclear deal, was to curb Iran's nuclear activity. The US pulled out of the deal in 2018, and now it wants to boycott Iran's defenses altogether in drawing on the very deal it's no longer party to. Iran's simplest response would be to pull out too and freely embark on its nuclear program, which is peaceful, but the West doesn't believe it is. Iran's toughest response would be to pull out of the NPT itself. That's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the purpose of which is to promote cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Now, where's the wisdom in pushing Iran out of its commitments? Mr. Izadi is a professor and expert in international law. His summary answers don't miss a point, so please award him your full attention.
You know, the United States decided to follow this maximum pressure campaign to the level that no one basically in the world accepts it. The United States wanted to overthrow the government in Iran. They have not been successful, obviously. They wanted to get more concessions out of Iran, and they have not been successful. They're actually losing the concessions they get under the nuclear agreement. So the policy of maximum pressure campaign has failed.
Mr. Mackey tends to include detail in his somewhat history-oriented analyses. He accepted an invitation to our studios. Can European countries and countries with a free economy save the JCPOA in spite of US bullying?
Over the past 2.5 years, the European nations were willing to save the JCPOA, but they failed even economically. Capitalism dominates those nations. Their companies may be working within the framework of national interests, but when it comes to profits and losses, they may no longer be on the same wavelength with their governments. That's exactly what European firms did with Iran over the past 2.5 years.
In its final ruse, only the Dominican Republic stood with the US. The E3 or Western European powers party to the nuclear deal actually called for unity in withstanding US rashness. Their statement read, "We call on all UNSC, UN Security Council members to refrain from any action that would only deepen divisions in the Security Council or that would have serious adverse consequences on its work."
I personally think that the Europeans are still willing to save the JCPOA. The reason is that the Europeans see the JCPOA as a major political and security breakthrough for themselves. After long years of intensive talks, an agreement was reached on the basis of non-proliferation with a nation they often accused of developing a suspicious nuclear program. Any collapse of such security-inspired agreement would have security consequences for the European governments. Over the past 2 decades, when the Middle East has experienced serious crisis, unrest and insecurity, the Europeans have genuinely felt the consequences of security crisis and insecurity in this region.
There's no legal ground and no common sense to the US demand, said Russia and China, Eastern powers party to the deal. To practically do something about it, Russia actually requested a meeting to discuss the US decision to trigger a snapback of sanctions on Iran. But seeing as the US objected to the meeting, Russia withdrew its request, saying it was unbecoming behavior for the US.
Not only the US does not have any international legal base, it's actually violating international law every day. The US is a member of the Security Council. One would expect for a permanent member of the UN Security Council to follow UN resolutions. And you have seen what the US has done in the last year or so, punishing countries that want to follow UN resolutions, in particular 2231. So the US is not only not following international law, the US is a rogue state that is violating all types of international law, whether it's UN resolutions or other laws that need to be followed.
Well, America's divorcing the JCPOA could be interpreted as breaking free of a familial marriage. A familial marriage would leave a cousin spouse with a little something of inheritance. And the US says, well, I'm a Security Council member and I have a say on the JCPOA, even if I'm no longer party to the deal. How would you respond?
It is true that US was a participant of JCPOA when the agreement was announced in 2015. But in 2018, 2 years ago, the US officially ended its participation. If you go to the White House website, even today, the title of that document is US ending participation, ceasing participation. The title is ceasing, and when you go to the text of the announcement, it uses the word end. You cannot go back in history and claim to be part of something that you ended your participation in. And that is why no one accepted US logic, because there was no logic.
In making a fundamental mistake, the US lost the chance to use the tools of the UN Security Council. It then started using illegal tactics and verbal games to announce that Iran should be subject to new sanctions. Still, the way the US has been strutting around on the claim it will make Iran's defense program go away at any cost, you would think it has some tools to enable it to unilaterally impose international sanctions. No country agrees with the US as far as sovereignty goes. What tools might the US be having to unilaterally impose international sanctions?
bullying is going to be one tool that the U.S. has used even in previous instances. In order to enforce, since there are no countries that are going to join U.S. in enforcement, U.S. is going to be alone. And that means that it's going to be much more difficult for U.S. to pressure Iran in comparison to when you have other countries joining.
ببینید به حال آمریکایی‌ها به عنوان یک بزرگترین قدرت اقتصادی جهان
The US, as the biggest economic and military power in the world, has the highest military spending in the world. Other nations are by far behind the US in terms of military spending. Therefore, the US wields heavy clout with global markets. Ever since Trump quit the JCPOA, owing to the US's influence on financial markets, the Americans managed to push European firms to choose between Iran and the US. As the US's secondary sanctions have pushed European firms out of Iran, the Americans think they can increase pressure by offering their arbitrary interpretation of Resolution 2031 of UN Security Council.
As the face and nature of diplomacy is distorted, rhetoric is becoming brash. Pretenses of knowing what's best for us are a thing of the past. What's now come to the fore is the US's America First policy. An Iran with a successful arms industry would be competition for America on international markets. Apart from the fact that Iran could be a hindrance to American adventurism. Security Council Resolution 2231 set up a process for the Iran arms embargo to end in 5 years. Now, lifting the embargo will enable Tehran to export weapons and technical services. And countries cut off from major arms markets would very likely be happy to buy its reasonably priced, efficient weapons systems. Popular candidates for sale would include surface-to-surface ballistic missiles and short and medium-range ballistic missiles. Regarding military independence, independence in arms and weaponry, where does Iran stand internationally? How do we rank?
Militarily, Iran is a very strong country, as has shown in the last many years, shooting down a very sophisticated U.S. drone with domestic technology. Something that's unique to Iran and a handful of countries. And that the reason U.S. has not attacked Iran is because of that military capability, because the cost of attacking Iran is going to be severe. And Iran is not Afghanistan, Iran is not Iraq, Iran is able to create severe pain.
America does deal plentifully, not only in more advanced weaponry, but also in light arms, even as a broker. Here it is. Light weaponry produced, say, in Eastern Europe has its uses to the US-led coalition. This is how. The coalition illicitly passes those weapons on to terror groups such as ISIS or Daesh and what was al-Nusra in Syria. Israel, for its part, operates out of the occupied Golan Heights to provide weapons, ammunition and logistical support to al-Qaeda rebels operating in southern Syria. Examples are aplenty. To see why Iran sees the US as the greatest threat to world peace and what defenses Iran itself has in the face of US threats, I'll be back in no time. To add spice, let's dip into other media outlets. To see what they have to say, I give you Shahrzad.
Hi, I'm Shahrzad Manicheri, and we'll be reviewing the latest update on the US's unprecedented isolation and snapping back sanctions on Iran. Tasting news agency reports US international prestige has fallen under Trump administration, says SIPRI chief. The director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute said that the U.S. international prestige has fallen quite a long way under the Trump administration. The European governments who are genuinely angry with the U.S. administration today would stand by the USA in a crisis tomorrow. I caution against reading too much into the current mood in and around the UN building in New York. International opinion polls, however, do confirm over many issues the U.S. is more unpopular than it has been for a long time. It is pretty clear that the USA's international prestige has fallen quite a long way under the Trump administration, Dan Smith told Tasneem in an interview. Mirror News states Japanese professor says lack of legitimacy, unilateral actions reason for U.S. failure. Professor Suzuki said that U.S. failure at the UNSC is the result of the country's unilateralism and a lack of legitimacy, adding that Trump's re-election will mean Americans endorse unilateralism. The power of UNSCR can be generated from the willingness of the international community as a whole. International law is not like domestic law. It has to be backed with the willingness and commitment of the international community. Unilateral action is not the way forward to build international consensus. In an article by the Al Monitor, we witnessed Rouhani calls U.S. snapback push final point of failure. Iranian officials have called the unilateral effort by the United States to implement snapback sanctions on Iran another failed attempt to enforce their will. President Hassan Rouhani said September 20th, the United States has been trying to once again place sanctions on Iran and has even increased its pressure in the last few months on other countries party to the Iran nuclear deal. Yet it has now reached the final point of failure. Rouhani said the United States has met failure every step of the way, even amongst traditional allies, and was not even able to stop the sanctions on arms from being lifted. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
Iran maintains countries that should be subject to arms embargoes in terms of exports and imports are precisely the United States and its allies. Master arms trafficker the Pentagon buys weapons from third countries to pass on to rebel and terror groups in West Asia and Africa, via its proxies and allies in the region. Abu Aliz is unit commander of the terror group that was called Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Front. He himself confirmed in a September 2016 interview that the US was sending weapons to al-Nusra through third countries. And yet he complained, yes, the US supports the opposition in Syria, but not directly. They support the countries that support us, but we are not yet satisfied with their support.
This is more in line with the rule of jungle. Whoever has might has right. And in 21st century that becomes more difficult to force because in 21st century we are not living in colonial times, or we are not living in the 19th century.
American allies passing on the US brokered weapons include Saudi Arabia, Israel and Qatar. And when Jabhat al-Nusra, or the Nusra Terror Front, was besieged, officers from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel and America were there to reportedly advise in the use of satellites, rockets and reconnaissance and thermal security cameras. In a different context and in violation of their agreements with the US, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are sending US-made weapons to Al-Qaeda-affiliated fighters, Salafi militias and other factions waging war in Yemen. This leaves the US complicit in tens of thousands of civilian deaths in Yemen. The report, by the way, comes from US TV CNN itself. Now, either the US administration has known all along what its allies are up to, or the Pentagon has lost control of them, which is as dangerous. The US may have lost control of its Arab allies, and in overdoing its political pre-election stunts on Iran, it may have lost its Western allies. And in yet going down the same path, it may have lost its authority. By imposing sanctions on Iran, The US is imposing sanctions on all countries dealing with Iran, needing to deal with Iran, be they allies or otherwise. The US is even talking of rejuvenating Resolution 1929 to complete its desired snapback process. Fellow global decision makers deem such action illegal. In other words, America is pushing countries into ignoring its demands and authority. UNSC Resolution 1929 obligates all countries to inspect suspect shipments en route to Iran and to destroy any banned cargo. Thing is, even when such UN resolutions against Iran were valid, no country dared implement their provisions against Iranian ships and cargo. Now, there's not even a legal basis for them to take such a risk. Such resolutions are rendered invalid by Resolution 2231, which the JCPOA rests on, and Iranian ships can be more at ease now. The US itself may attempt stopping and searching commercial ships to and from Iran, but in having to survive sanctions, Iran has taken great strides, and it is no sitting duck. The 6 annulled resolutions. What sanctions did they uphold, and which ones does the US want to rejuvenate?
این اقدامی که آمریکا در جهت فعال کردن مکانیزم ماشه.
The snapback mechanism would restore the sanctions that had been imposed on Iran through 6 UN Security Council resolutions from 2006 to 2011, covering a wide range of fields including political and economic sanctions, as well as cooperation between Iran and other nations. The UN sanctions would bar Iran from any financial and commercial transactions with any entity in the world.
You may wonder what other defenses Iran has in the face of US threats. Passive reaction to snapping back sanctions could be Iran's stopping the implementation of the additional protocol, increasing the uranium enrichment level, and ending cooperation with the IAEA, which will make the West regret the triggering of the snapback. But when it comes to destroying cargo, or worse, aiming weapons at Iran and Iranians, well, here's some relatable examples of where we've gotten to for defense and retaliation or for sale.
Unfortunately, today such mechanism at the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Security Council have turned into bodies tasked with implementing US policies. But the world is asking why they failed to produce any document to prove their claim that Iran was developing nuclear arms. The Americans are pursuing their attempts aimed at isolating Iran and spread Iranophobia for the purpose of selling their arms. But this policy is threadbare now.
What is important is that whatever Iran's military capabilities are, most of these capabilities, maybe 99%, are domestically made. So Iran is independent, unlike Saudi Arabia or some of the Persian Gulf states that have to import everything, including importing technicians to run the things they have bought with petrodollars.
I mentioned the missile program earlier. Not to forget, 2 new missiles were recently uncovered named after Qasem Soleimani and Abu al-Mahdi, the Iranian and Iraqi commanders assassinated by the US on the 3rd of January outside the Baghdad airport. To carry on, Iran has reverse-engineered anti-tank guided missile BGM-71 Tufan 125. Sina Azodi, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, anticipates what would be in demand. That includes light infantry weapons system and artillery systems such as the RAD 155mm self-propelled howitzer. He says, I do think that given the Iranians' expertise in anti-tank and anti-ship missiles, those are on the top of the list.
The US has already exerted pressure on North Korea and Iran. It is now ratcheting up pressure on China. It is even pressuring Russia, not to mention tiny states like some European nations. Therefore, they have yet to reach an Iran-style understanding to choose a path for themselves. We are now waiting for them to retrieve their intellectual independence and stand against US allies. That would serve all nations in the world.
Sanctions made Iranians suffer, but ultimately they led to considerable advancement. Iran takes ongoing US sanctions as superficial efforts in vain at best, and as pre-election stunts at best. US presidential elections are as close as November. Talking of advancement, drones are another thing Iranians would gladly sell to allies. Russians have already shown an interest. Over the years, Iran has been producing increasingly more advanced drones. Conventional artillery weapons and small arms have already enjoyed marketability in past. Time to say bye. Till next time at the same times, when I hope you'll join us again. Don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Thanks for watching from the whole team.